Hi, this is Tropical Plants at 53 degrees north. So, mistakes, we all make them. And I'm going to go through 5 of my mistakes that I've made, some of my biggest mistakes, in fact, in relation to growing tropical plants and house plants. And I thought that perhaps you might learn from them and share your experiences too. So, let's jump in. And we are in, and we start off with light, and that's why we're staring at one. Let's just assume that we all know that light plays an important part, and that we all know, or we think we know, whether our plants are getting enough light or not. And this brings me to mistake number 1. In my particular case, yes, I know that light's important. I know that plants need lots of light in order to photosynthesize, but what I didn't really realize being in a greenhouse, because of course you would think being in a greenhouse and having grow lights that I'd solve my light issues, what I didn't realize was that no, in fact, these plants are very high light plants, or most of them are very high light plants, not all of them. I'm speaking in general terms here. The tropical plants, they're used to lots of light, certainly more light than the English climate provides. And it's only by testing it and having a look and actually seeing what the light levels are that I realised how low the light levels are in my greenhouse, despite having grow lights on all the time. So that's mistake number 1. The light levels just aren't up to scratch, and it's these beautifully evolved eyes of ours that are to blame, because we think we know what the light levels are. But of course our eyes adjust to the intensity of the light, and they let as much light in as possible. So we think it's bright, but of course it's not. And that's where light meters come in. And if you can afford a lux meter, even better. So mistake number 1 is not really appreciating the fact that my light levels weren't high enough. That's something I'm now trying to solve by buying more grow lights and positioning them in a slightly better place than they were before. So number 2 in the mistakes that I've made is all to do with the potting media that the plant's growing in. So take the average orchid. So this beautiful little orchid here, it's a species orchid. This is growing at the moment in just bark. Now, what if this orchid was growing in a different country? What if it was in a hot country, somewhere like Cyprus, for example, where for the most part in the year, the temperature doesn't get anywhere near frosty. It's practically sunny all the time, even in the middle of winter. And that plant's getting lots of light, lots of sunshine through some glass, as well as dry, low humidity atmosphere. So will it need exactly the same media? Well, of course, no, it won't. This particular plant needs to be kept moist. And if you ask some experts on it, they'll say that they grow near streams and rivers, and they actually are constantly being splashed by water. So if you grow it in a place where the conditions make it dry out very, very quickly, your choice of media is going to be completely different to what it's going to be in a place like here, where the temperatures are cool, there isn't much sunshine, it's low light levels, and my problem is that things don't dry out, not that they dry out too quickly. So your choice of media will matter. The main mistake that I made initially was thinking that the choice of media was purely down to the particular plant that was growing in that media. That's only part of the solution. You've got to look at the wider environment and think that's really the next level up. You need to look at the big picture. So number 3 on my list of the biggest mistakes I've made when looking after these plants is all to do with watering. Now, overwatering, underwatering, I've never actually heard of it just right watering, but these are words that are bandied around, and very often watering can be the issue at first for newbies growing these plants. Again, I'm specifically talking about here houseplants and tropical plants. If you live in a country like mine and you're growing plants outside, very rarely a problem. You can give those plants as much water as you like and they're not likely to drown, they're not likely to rot, because they're adapted for those particular situations. But our house plants are not adapted for our house, they're not adapted for being in a pot, I think when it comes to watering, there are several levels that you go through as you begin to progress and your understanding increases. So the first level of understanding is when you research the plant. You Google it, don't you? So you get yourself a nice plant, you Google it and you see what that plant needs. So for example, it might be a Masdevallia ignea like this, and you might look it up and think, right, okay, it needs to be kept moist most of the time. Or you might look at something like a Tradescantia tricolour like this, and you might look at it and think, right, it needs to be kept dry for most of the time. That's the first level of understanding, I think, when you first begin to grow these plants. The next level up, I think, is when you realise that that little bit of runoff that you get in the tray underneath, you water it through, it sits in some water, that can be the cause of lots and lots of issues. Newbies, when they first start to water their plants and they leave that bit of water in the bottom, they very quickly realise that that can cause the roots to rot off. It's not a good idea for plants to be sitting in water for the most part. Of course, there are some that are adapted for that, but most of the house plants aren't adapted for that, and that's the next level up of understanding. You must make sure that your plant drains well. The third level of understanding, in my opinion, is that you begin to realise that plants need different amounts of water at different times of the year. So if your plant is growing strongly like this, it's producing blooms, there's very strong shoots coming on it, again, in general here, the plant will need more water, or it's likely to need more water. As soon as it finishes its growth phase, then you need to reduce that watering. So I think that's something that dawns on people as time goes on and they look after that plant for more than just a couple of months. They've got a whole season under their belt and they're on to that next level of understanding. Okay, so in my opinion, the real ninja level of watering comes when you begin to realise that the media plays quite an important role. It's not just about letting the water drain through. It's not just about knowing that if your plant's in the growth phase, it's going to need more water. You begin to realise that the media makes a big difference. So again, it comes down to your conditions again. So if your conditions are hot, dry, windy, very sunny, then you're going to need a different media for most of those plants than if your conditions are the exact opposite of cold, dull, damp, I hasten to add, miserable. And that's when you begin to change the actual potting media that the plant sits in. So you respond to what's going on. You realise that the plant maybe is not drying out and it needs to dry out. So you add something to that mixture in the pot to make sure that it drains through really quickly. Or you do the opposite. You add something like moss to a pot to retain some more moisture. Means you don't have to water it as much, means that it won't dry out quite as quickly. So these are all to do with the watering. It's not just media separate from the watering. They're very tightly entwined, and I think that's the next level up in terms of understanding what your plants need when it comes to watering. Okay, so number 4 in the mistakes that I've made when growing houseplants is something that we all do, I think, and even when you know the problem, you still do it. And that is seeing plants in a garden centre or a nursery or online and buying it on impulse because you like what it looks like. We all do it, I'm sure we do. What we should really do is look at our conditions and see what grows well for us. So for example, I've found that in general, begonias grow well for me, streptocarpus grow well for me, and in that case, I've bought more of them. I also find Tradescantia grow well for me. That certain orchids seem to grow well for me, but there are a number of orchids that just can't cope with the really dull, cooler conditions and just can't cope with the fact that they just don't dry out. I can leave them weeks on end and they don't dry out, even if I change the media on them. And that's something that I've learnt to live with, and I've learnt then to purchase plants that are a little more conducive to the constraints of how I can change my conditions. So how more cost effective would it be if we did it the opposite way around? If we actually made a list of what the conditions are that we can offer and then search for plants that matched those conditions. Of course, if that was something that I did, then I would be growing tomatoes and potatoes in here and daffodils, but I'm just as victim to it as everybody else. And even though I know what I should do, I still make impulse purchases. What can I say? We're plant lovers, we're only human. And the final mistake I'm going to talk about today is all about humidity. So I'd assumed that having the central heating on, the radiators on in the house during winter would lead to very low humidity levels, like below 35%. Well, I was wrong, and it was only by testing it with some actual humidity meters in several rooms that I began to realise that the humidity very closely matches what's going on outside. So you can see here, down here, I have a fogger and I've switched it off. I switched it off when I made a video all about humidity, because that forced me to learn about humidity and to actually do some testing and measuring. So you can see that in here, the humidity is still 76%, despite the fact that I'm not actually creating any humidity. And most of these plants in here will only start to struggle if the humidity is below about 35% for a length of time, not just for like a few hours or overnight or during the day. So it's only by testing these things, and that's something that's really important. Try not to make assumptions, try to actually measure and test something, and then you know for sure. So that's one example where I've done that. Another example is of course the light, where I assumed that by having grow lights that would solve my lighting issue, and it was only by testing it with a lux meter that I realised that the light at the canopy of the plants, at the surface of the plants, was still way too low in most cases, or certainly outside the tolerances of those plants. So don't make assumptions, test and experiment, and that's something that I'm trying to do for the most part. So that's just 5 of the worst mistakes I've made when growing these plants. So now it's over to you. Can you tell me in the comments if you relate to any of those, what your experiences are, or if there's a mistake that you've made that you've learnt from and hopefully not made the same mistake again. So write it in the comments down below. I'd love to hear from you. And if you're interested in houseplants, I think you should go and watch this video, which I'm going to put up here right now. So for now, I'll see you on the next one. Bye.